For this afternoon and tonight, a significant winter storm, including heavy snow with limited trainings.
Hello, and welcome to the Snowbrains podcast, where it's my job to interview the most intelligent people in the snow sports industry and pass their fascinating knowledge on to you, our listeners. I'm your host, Miles Clark. I'm a professional free skier, professional mountain guide, a UC Berkeley molecular cell biology graduate, the founder and CEO of Snowbrains. And I was such a picky eater as a kid that I didn't even like pizza. I had to bring bag lunches to all my team dinners, and even Chuck E. Cheese's was kind of lame. My dad once offered me $20 to eat a strawberry when I was about 10 years old, and I wouldn't touch it. My poor parents. Today's Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Tamarack Resort. Nestled in the west central mountains of Idaho, Tamarack boasts 1,100 acres of terrain, 2,800 vertical feet, and an independent spirit and community vibe unmatched in the West. My guest today is Dr. Ethan Greene. Dr. Greene has been the director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center since 2005. He's worked in the snow and avalanche world since 1990. He grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and was a ski patroller at Big Sky, Montana, and he's been a backcountry forecaster for the Utah Avalanche Center. Dr. Greene has an undergraduate degree in meteorology, a master's in atmospheric science, a Ph.D. in geoscience. He's written 2 books on snow science and avalanches and has over 45 publications in the snow science world, and he is obviously an avid backcountry skier. Hello, Ethan. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. How are you, man?
I'm great, Miles. Nice to see you again, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
I always appreciate your time, and I'm always curious, when did you ski last?
Well, actually, it's been a little while for me. It's probably been about 10 days at this point. It's just sort of the time of year and some other things were going on. So I haven't been on my skis, in over a week.
How many days this season?
Oh, pretty slim so far. I think I'm still less than 10 for the year. I've spent more time in my boots than I have on my skis at this point.
But that's pretty good for the end of November. Not bad. So we'll take it, right? It's been a weird early season.
Yeah, the conditions in Colorado are, well, let's say, not as great as we would like for this time of year. So there's some snow you can still get around, but it's not as inspiring as it has been in other years.
Yeah, and speaking of something not being inspiring, I feel like we have to start with the obvious. The USA had 37 avalanche deaths last season, which was the most we've ever recorded in one season. Yes, there was a tragic avalanche accident that happened on a train in Stevens Pass, Washington, killed 96 people back in 1910. But that's an entirely different story. Those people didn't choose to be an avalanche train, whereas these 37 people did make that choice. So we had 37 avalanche deaths in the USA last season, the most we've ever recorded in one season. Ethan, what do you think happened last season to lead to so many avalanche fatalities in the USA?
There's a lot that goes into that. And yeah, just to start out with, I guess, when we look at avalanche accident statistics, we tend to look at before 1950 and after 1950. And that's a little bit of an artificial break, but essentially it gets to what you're talking about, where after 1950, primarily people getting killed in avalanches, those are recreational accidents. So people that are going out into the mountains to do some sort of recreation and getting caught up in this hazard. We do see the most deadly periods in the United States before 1950, both in Colorado and across the US, but mostly those are some sort of industrial accident. When people were moving into the West, they were going up into the mountains, they were starting mines, they were starting logging operations, they were building settlements in new places. And so really, really different drivers that got people in the way of avalanches.
So now it's mostly recreational. And what do you think are some of the factors that came together to cause so many avalanche fatalities last year in the USA?
There's a lot that goes into what happened last year, but to look at it from maybe a simple perspective, to state the obvious, For fatal avalanche accidents, you need two things. You need avalanches and you need people in harm's way. Last year, we had a lot of factors that brought both of those issues to the forefront. As far as, people in the backcountry, certainly with the global pandemic, there's more and more people that are interested in outdoor recreation of all kinds, and winter recreation was certainly part of that. And so, although we don't really know how many people are involved in winter backcountry recreation, it's kind of an amorphous number. We don't even really necessarily know how to define that. But if you talk to anybody who's out skiing, snowmobiling, using our public lands, they would tell you that there were just more people out. So that's one part. And then the other part is that we had pretty bad avalanche conditions or unusual avalanche conditions across the United States. How bad really depends on where you were. In Colorado, we put it as kind of a 1 in 10 year event. So not unprecedented. We certainly see conditions like this in Colorado with some regularity, but also not what you see every year. So, about the last time we saw something like this was around 2012. And what we were telling people is that if you had skied in Colorado for 20 years, this could be the second time that you had seen conditions like this. In other parts of the country, people saw things that were a little bit more unusual. I know the folks at the Sawtooth Avalanche Center in Ketchum talked about
and that's in Idaho.
In Idaho, yes, that's right. Talked more like a 1 in 30 year event. So they saw conditions that they felt like were a lot more unusual than what we saw here in Colorado.
Whoa, that's intense. And so you mentioned the pandemic. So I wanted to ask you about that. So we all think the pandemic probably led to that. People were, kind of stuck at home. Recreation was local recreation was their best outlet. And I'm curious, though, also about early season snow. How did early season snow play into last year's avalanche problem?
Well, in general, early season snow is not good for us in the avalanche world. Again, this changes a little bit depending on where you are across the country. But what we typically see in Colorado is, Colorado is a generally kind of a cold and windy place. And so if we have early season snow, it tends to form a basal weak layer, a layer of faceted snow near the ground that causes avalanches for us once it gets buried later on in the winter, oftentimes for weeks or months, or like last year, really most of the winter season.
Absolutely. So we'll get into that a little bit more moving forward. So that early season snow can really be a problem, and that might be happening a bit this season already. So at one point last season, namely February, we had 27 avalanche deaths in only 29 days, which is another unfortunate record. Ethan, what do you think happened during this window? What factors came together to cause this terrible 29-day stretch in the USA?
Well, like everything with avalanches, as you dig into it, things get a little bit more complicated. But again, from that high-level perspective, we had buried weak layers in the snowpack over most of the U.S. Some places those were very close to the ground. Some places they were a little bit higher in the snowpack. And then we had a really wet February. In some places, I think we set records for the most amount of snow during that month. Certainly in Colorado, we had really heavy precipitation, and it just kept coming day after day. Like you said, this stretched really for the entire month. And so with those big loading events, with that buried weak layer, we were able to get elevated avalanche conditions in some places, very high, going up into the extreme level in Utah. In Colorado, we had a bunch of avalanche warnings and a lot of days at considerable, where it was just really easy to trigger avalanches as a backcountry recreationalist.
And even those avalanches in February, I think some of that was as a result of some of that early season snow we might have gotten in October and November. Do you think that might be true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what was going on in Utah, and again, you should talk to people that were there rather than me stuck over here in Colorado, but, they had those bad weak layers near the ground, and then they just got a huge amount of precip all on top of it. And eventually it was enough to break the camel's back, so to speak. And they produced really large avalanches. In some cases, avalanches that were larger than what people could remember in those specific paths.
Yeah, historic avalanches. It was terrifying. And 3 of those avalanche accident events had 3 or more deaths associated with them, which is kind of crazy. How common are these multi-person avalanche fatality events?
Well, I don't remember the statistics right off the top of my head. Certainly, it felt like those accidents that we were seeing were unusual. I think there's some issues that came out just beyond just the number of people, like, the accident that happened in Utah where there was multiple groups involved. Like those sorts of stories are just really terrifying. And, for me personally, like I don't remember an accident where that an avalanche triggered and involved multiple groups all buried in this same debris pile.
And that Utah avalanche that he referenced is the Mill Creek avalanche that killed 4 people in February last year. And that was just terrifying. That really woke us all up and got us scared.
What we came away with from last year was that it felt like there was a bunch of these multiple person accidents, and there were, but it wasn't as unusual as we felt like it was, just from, kind of that gut perspective.
Because I think you're right. The gut reaction was, oh my gosh, what the hell is happening? This seems really abnormal. But then, maybe you dig into the database and you find, wow, it's not as abnormal as we want it to be.
No, I think that's right. I mean, part of what was really unusual about the Mill Creek accident was the 2 parties.
Yes.
And again, that's not unprecedented, but having multiple groups involved like that is just a kind of a scary situation. And, certainly, it really captures your attention. I mean, God, what a terrible story.
So we had this terrible avalanche season last year. And I'm curious, what are the biggest lessons from last year's avalanche season? What can we learn from what happened?
Well, I think the lessons are a little bit different in different parts of the country. So since Colorado is where I work, I'll just focus on that. And I think what we saw was people that were aware that the avalanche conditions were bad and were trying to go places that they felt like were safe or appropriate for those conditions, but really underestimating the characteristics of these avalanches, how easy they were to trigger, and that you could trigger them remotely quite easily.
Scary.
And so going places they felt like were safe, but that weren't for those particular conditions. And there's a lot that goes into like what to do in a particular case like that. Unfortunately, I think it really comes down in some cases to just the basics of avalanche safety. Really not thinking about a particular ski tour or snowmobile route or slope as dangerous or safe, but really thinking about the characteristics of the terrain for triggering avalanches. What's the slope angle? What's the potential run out for a particular avalanche? How connected is the terrain? Can you trigger something remotely that's going to release an avalanche in a place that you don't expect? And really thinking in a year like that, where we see all of these remote triggered avalanches, that you just need to give things a wide berth and at certain times just stay on low angle terrain.
That is a huge takeaway for me personally, at least, is that when we do have these high avalanche danger ratings and knowledge of, hey, it's scary out there, slope angle becomes absolutely critical. It literally becomes life and death. So that's something that I think is a big takeaway for all of us this year. Let's really all work on slope angle, calculating slope angle, measuring slope angle, knowing what we are going to be on or be near, especially if it's so dangerous that we could get remote triggered avalanches. That is just terrifying to me.
Well, and I think it really goes into digging into the details of the avalanche forecast a little bit more. I mean, a lot of times people tend to focus on the danger rating, which is a really good place to start, but you can have avalanches with different characteristics in every one of the avalanche danger rating levels. And so that's why the Avalanche Forecast Centers provide information about avalanche problems to give you a little better idea of how these avalanches are going to behave. And then, of course, the other aspects of those problems, the size, how easy they are to trigger. And when you start seeing, persistent slab avalanches that are easy to trigger, and especially as they start to get over a size D2 or a large avalanche on most Avalanche Forecast Centers websites, you just need to give that terrain a really wide berth and be very conservative.
I agree. And I think what we saw last season should just be a huge wake-up call for all of us. And I'm sure that you agree. That was really bad. It was really scary. There's a lot to learn there. And so I want to think about moving forward. What should we all be wary of rolling into the 21-22 Avalanche season?
Well, I'm not sure if it's really that different than any other year, but if you're spending a lot of time in avalanche terrain, this is the time of year where you want to start getting clued into what's happening in the snowpack. Like you mentioned earlier, in a lot of parts of the U.S., we do have snow on the ground. The snowpack's not very thick. We're in a kind of a terrible dry spell right now, and so we are forming some weak layers. And certainly in Colorado, we see just a little bit of snow. We start to see avalanche activity over the last couple of weeks. It doesn't take very much. And so what that tells me is that, we have a very weak underlying snowpack. It's not that big of a deal today because we don't have anything stacked on top of it. But as we start getting more snow on it later in the year, it could turn into another pretty dangerous year. Whether it'll be like last year or not, it's a little too early to tell. I certainly hope that we don't go into a cycle like that, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities. So you just need to be tracking what's happening over the next, 6 weeks or so.
So let's jump right into that. I think that's great advice. So early season snow, it could be a problem. So can you walk us through why early season snow can be dangerous and how it might contribute to avalanches and all this in the season to come?
Early season snow is often problematic for us, and it really just goes into forming some of those weak layers, what we call persistent weak layers, or layers of faceted snow. Sometimes people call them small facets or near surface facets or depth hoar, but it's all part of these layers that form in the snowpack that can produce avalanches for us for weeks and months. To form that, we need a strong temperature gradient in the snowpack. Again, we can get that in a lot of different ways, but if we have a thin snowpack and we have very cold temperatures like we do right now in Colorado, we tend to see that snow that's sitting on the ground facet. It forms this very weak structure. It's not a big deal when it's the only part of the snowpack that we have, but when we have a weak structure and we pile a lot of snow on it later on in the year, we're going to get a big slab of snow sitting on a weak layer, and that's a bad recipe for avalanches.
It absolutely is. And for some of our listeners who might be new to this, the ground is almost always considered 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so when you only have a little bit of snow and then it's, Colorado temperatures, it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside, that's the temperature gradient he's talking about. So you're going from 32 degrees to 10 degrees and moisture is just moving through that snow, creating these facets, which are large crystals that are low density, that are like ball bearings. So really bad. Once you put a bunch of snow on top of that, you're getting a really weak layer, and that snow on top is going to be able to move quite easily and so easily triggered. So that's what we're hoping doesn't happen this year, but might actually be shaping up to happen this year. So we all need to be aware of that. Go ahead.
It's already happening. And so for that temperature gradient, it's really, the change in temperature over a distance. And so if we have a large temperature change over a short distance, which is what we have right now, like you're talking about, it's right around freezing at the ground, and the air temperature is quite cold. And so you have, your thin snowpack sandwiched between those two temperature data points. If we had, 4 meters of snow, that same temperature change wouldn't really be that big of a deal, but it's the big temperature change over a shallow snowpack that causes our problem.
So touch on that a little bit more. What have you seen physically? It sounds like you've been out there in Colorado. What are we seeing in Colorado snowpack wise this early season so far?
It's not that great, really.
Oh gosh. Well, I'm glad we can laugh about it now.
This is not that unusual for us. Colorado, we're far away from the oceans. The snowpack is generally thin. It's a cold and windy place. And so, we have heavily faceted snowpack almost every year. What we have right now is the snowpack is just a lot thinner than we usually see. And we've had plenty of cold temperatures. We got lots of wind moving the snow around. So we have a lot of thin snow out there. And that underlying snowpack is pretty weak. The places that we're seeing avalanches right now are where we're building slabs of snow from wind action, from wind transport on top of that very weak snow. So there are, even though there's not a lot of snow here right now, there are places where you can trigger avalanches. There are, unfortunately, also the places where you have the deepest snow and maybe the best riding conditions.
Of course.
But where you have, wind drifts that are forming on top of that old weaker snow, Those are the places that are easy to trigger avalanches right now. Fortunately, we are moving away from our last kind of wind and snow event. We're, maybe 5 days away from it right now. So the number of places where you can trigger one of those slides is decreasing. But what we've been seeing is that every time we get a little bit of snow and wind, and it doesn't take too much. I mean, really, we saw some activity with, kind of 5 to 8 inches of snow and wind out of the last storm. It doesn't take too much to build a new slab and really increase the number of places you can trigger an avalanche. And at least for the first day or two, those avalanches are pretty sensitive. They're pretty easy to trigger.
Today's Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Tamarack Resort. You might come to Tamarack for the views that unfold across the valley or the unspoiled terrain and vast open bowls. Maybe you'll come to uncover a place that's a little different, that's down to earth and at home on the path less traveled. But we know you'll come back because there's a community of people at Tamarack who make you feel like you're in the right place at the right time. So you mentioned that Colorado is used to faceted snow, which is dangerous. Let's just put it simply. So I want to touch on that a little bit more. So Colorado sees more avalanche fatalities than any other state, and by a lot. So for example, since 1950, Colorado has seen 305 avalanche deaths, with the next closest state being Alaska at 165. So they're almost twofold more than the closest state, which is very remarkable. So you've touched on this a little bit, but let's just hit it right on the head. Why does Colorado see more avalanche fatalities than any other state?
Well, part of that is the period of record that you're looking at. If you look at a shorter time period where there's been more people doing recreation in a lot of the Western states, we're still leading the pack, unfortunately, but not by as far. So There is a chance that somebody else will overtake us at some point. But in essence, again, like to have fatal avalanche accidents, you need people and the ability to trigger avalanches. And Colorado has a lot of both. We have a long history of winter recreation in the state, and it's as you know, there's a lot of people that are out here traveling around the backcountry, getting into avalanche terrain and trying to enjoy the great public lands in Colorado. We also have a pretty tricky snowpack. We're a continental snow climate. So if you looked at the Western United States, you look at the Sierra and the Cascades as being a maritime snow climate, the Wasatch in Utah and up towards the Tetons and Jackson Hole and maybe up towards Bozeman in Montana as being an intermountain snow climate. And then us as a continental snow climate, that just means that we're far away from an ocean. We got high elevation, we got lots of winds, cold temperatures. And so again, like generally a thin snowpack with cold temperatures and a lot of thin spots, we produce a lot of persistent weak layers. And we tend to see avalanche cycles that last for weeks and months, someplace closer to the coast where you have generally, again, this is over a long time period, kind of warmer temperatures and a thicker snowpack. You'll see the avalanche danger rise dramatically with a really big storm that comes in, but then fall off pretty quick. Whereas in Colorado, we tend to linger in that moderate and considerable range a lot. We will rise up to considerable or maybe even high with a big storm, and then we drop down, but we don't drop that quickly. We'll linger in considerable, and then oftentimes we won't get below moderate for a couple of months.
And so Colorado is definitely a unique snowpack. It's definitely a tricky snowpack. What can Colorado backcountry travelers, or what should Colorado backcountry travelers be really tuned into more than people in other places?
Well, it's understanding that the avalanche danger kind of lingers in that mid-range, and really that's the most dangerous time for us. Across the country, most fatal avalanche accidents happen at considerable. In Colorado, we're sort of bridging moderate and considerable. And that's because when the avalanche danger is low, you can still trigger an avalanche, but it's really gets a lot harder to find the place where you can get into trouble. When the avalanche danger is high or extreme, typically we're in some really big storm. It's really obvious that you should be thinking about avalanches. And when we're at moderate considerable, we can have a lot of different situations, but a common situation is that you have blue skies and, fresh snow. It's a wonderful day to be out in the backcountry, but you also have the conditions where you can trigger a very dangerous avalanche. And so we get kind of that mixed message from nature in that middle part of the danger scale, which makes it the most deadly.
And on that danger scale, sort of makes me think of what months of the year are the most dangerous in Colorado, and which are the most safe?
Typically, the most dangerous months are the heart of the winter. So kind of January, February, March. And that's typically because in the early season, we're forming our basal weak layers, and avalanches, just like now, are not very big. Then we start getting a lot more snow on top of those weak layers in the middle part of the winter. And so that's when you get both the ability to trigger avalanches, but also avalanches that are large enough to really be very dangerous. In general, the spring is a much safer time in Colorado. We start to move into April or May. We have a much more consolidated snowpack. Maybe those buried weak layers have got some water in them, and they've gained some strength, or maybe we just have a thick enough snowpack that we've insulated them, and at least from a recreational perspective, we're not affecting them as much. And oftentimes we get actually quite good skiing into May and sometimes into June in the state.
Great advice. Yeah, I think it's really key to know what months are dangerous, what months could be more safe, and tune into that as well. And thinking of that, tuning in, what can we all do this early season to be as prepared as possible for avoiding avalanches this year?
Well, this year, I think, what you want to do is really start reading the avalanche forecast, even if you're not going out into the backcountry that much. So you get kind of an idea of what's going on. That information is going to help you later on in the year. We're also, a lot of the centers and us as well, are putting out a lot of information on social media. So if you don't want to plow through the forecast discussion every day, just following one of those social media channels, and you'll get some tips and tricks, and you'll just get enough information to sort of be in tune into what's happening. Of course, if you're planning to spend a lot of time in avalanche terrain, checking the forecast every day if you can, and really understanding how things are evolving. The other things you can do are, to get prepped up for winter. Go out with your group of friends and start practicing your rescue skills. Make sure that all your equipment's, ready to go. Make sure your beacon skills are up to par. And just start to get excited about going out into the backcountry. Rescue is one of those things that, we hope that we never have to use. And it's certainly scary to think about doing an avalanche rescue. But the actual mechanics, the skills of, looking for beacons, looking for deeper beacons, playing with probing and shoveling, that can actually be pretty fun if you're not having to do it for real. So going out with your friends and just practicing, making sure everybody's tuned up, everybody knows what to do if something goes wrong.
And it does make you feel great. It kind of makes you feel like a badass. And it definitely ups your value in anybody else's eyes, because it's like, wow, all right, Ethan's on his game right now. I want him on my team when we go out there. There's definitely a lot of value in there, both, and social value too, right? So all good stuff there. What are our best tools to avoid getting caught in avalanches?
It's really what you got between your ears. That's your best tool.
I like that.
And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And I think, one of the things that is important when we think about avalanche safety is to match our approach to avalanche safety to our goals as a recreationalist. You can really you can drop your risk really low by just staying on low angle terrain. And for some people, that's a really great strategy, right? They're scared of avalanches. They don't want to be involved in it. They don't want to take as much time to really fine tune thinking about avalanche hazard and how it's working. Just stay on the low angle terrain, stay off of steep slopes and out from under steep slopes. Take a look at the avalanche forecast. Make sure that you're going out on low and moderate days. That alone can drop your risk substantially. If what you want to do, your goal is to really be in avalanche terrain and ascend and descend very steep slopes, then you have to dig into it in a lot more detail. And that's really understanding the character of these avalanches, what their distribution is in the terrain, the aspects and elevations, where avalanches are happening. What are the weak layers? What are the structures in the snowpack that are producing those avalanches, and how are they varying through the terrain? And there's a lot of ways to do that. Of course, the way to start is by reading the avalanche forecast for your area, because you've got a group of people that are tracking this every day. So you don't have to do it every day, but then trying to scale the information they're giving you to the places that you want to go. So you can start to think about these particular routes or particular slopes you want to go on to, and if those places are safe today.
Thank you for all that fantastic information. And I really agree. I think there's so many facets, if you will, no pun intended, on all that. There's so much to learn there. And so if this all does sound confusing to you, there's so much great resource. There's so many great resources out there. Get educated. To have these avalanche classes, they're everywhere now, because especially since the pandemic, everybody's interested. Go out and get yourself educated, dig into the forecast, dig into the observations. There's a lot of resources out there that you can really learn so much and really help yourself make better decisions in avalanche terrain. And you referred a few times to staying on low angle terrain. What degree slope do we need to stay below to be considered safe terrain?
Well, it depends a little bit on the situation, but in general, 30 degrees. If you're staying on slopes that are less steep than 30 degrees, and that's, about a blue slope, an intermediate slope at a ski area. You talked a little bit about measuring slope angles. That's a great thing to get used to doing. There's also some tools out there where you can look at digital representations of the terrain that will give you some idea of the slope angle. You don't want to replace looking at stuff on the computer or your phone with looking at stuff that's in front of you or right out there on the terrain. But these planning tools can be super helpful to sort of get an idea of what you might be facing before you get out there. But if you're sticking on that low angle terrain, your chances of triggering an avalanche are going to be much, much less. Again, depending on the character of the avalanche, if we're starting to deal with persistent weak layers and the potential for remote triggering, you need to think about the terrain that you're connected to. So not just the slope that you're on, but what's above you or maybe adjacent to you. Understanding a little bit about terrain traps is also a really good idea. In general, gullies are things to avoid. Think about if you do get caught in even a small avalanche, where it's going to take you. Is it going to take you into some trees or into rocks or over a cliff? Those are all things you want to be thinking about, but those are things that are relatively easy to anticipate and avoid if your goal is really just avalanche avoidance.
Absolutely. And I think really what we're all getting at is just that awareness. No matter what the forecast says, still be aware, take in new data, create forecasts in your head. Don't just walk blind into anything. Think, because it's X angle, it's going to be fine. Or, because the forecast said that it's safe, it's going to be fine. No, things are changing all the time. Take in new data, make your own forecasts in your head as well when you're out there. Use the data that's out there, combine it with the data that you see, and make your own decisions on exactly where you are and what you're doing right then. And I think that's huge advice. Another little quick thing I want to say too is, staying below 30 degrees is great. That's sort of the blue square. The problem is the terrain most skiers like, right, is that 30 to 45 degrees, which is that perfect black diamond zone. And that's the most dangerous. So that's kind of a good thing for me. Whenever I look at a slope and I think, oh yeah, this looks awesome, I also think, who else thinks this is awesome? Avalanches. So anytime I'm excited to ski a slope because I like the pitch, I need to really recalibrate. Okay, if I like this pitch, avalanches like this pitch too. So we need to really think again about, is this safe before I just get excited and go? So
yeah,
go ahead.
It's a good check just to, if you start getting excited about something, it's a good time to take a deep breath and think about the avalanche aspects as well. And I think, for most of us, we're not saying that you should avoid those places that get you excited, those steeper, more challenging, more interesting areas completely. What we're saying is that you want to match what your recreational goals are for the day, what your plan is for the day to the conditions of the day. So that means that, some days it's time to, get into that steeper terrain and try to check off some of those goals that you've been thinking about for days, weeks, or years. And other times it's time to step back and go enjoy the low angle POW turns and avoid those steeper areas because they're really dangerous. And it's really more about matching those two things. What am I trying to do today? And do the avalanche conditions, are they appropriate for that? That's the key.
I am guilty of not always having a great plan for the day. Usually it's like an objective, and that's not always the best way to approach this. So what is the best way to approach the plan for the day?
Well, different people feel more comfortable with different levels of plans. And so really figuring out what you and your group want to do is important. But, certainly it's a lot easier to match the avalanche conditions to your plan if you know where you're going to go and what slopes you're going to be traveling on. So having an idea of hey, our plan A is to head up to this area and travel through this terrain on these slopes and egress this other drainage or other slope, that can help you anticipate the aspects and elevations, the elevation band that you're going through, the direction of the slopes that you're going to travel on face, and make sure that the avalanche conditions are appropriate to be traveling in those areas. You can also, end up with hey, our first plan is to go up here and take a look at this and see if what the information we're collecting in the field supports traveling on those slopes. And if not, we have a backup plan, which is, maybe a little bit safer, a little lower angle, maybe a different slope aspect that provides a greater degree of safety.
I really like that. Have a plan, and then have a plan that's based on what you have read, or at least what you know about the avalanche conditions, and then have a plan B to back off of that and be safe. And in general, you don't need to go past your plan. You're usually not going to want to go more aggressive. At least that's my feeling. So yeah, get out there, see what's going on. If it seems a little bit unsafe, take a step back and make sure you have ways to get in and out of that terrain without being exposed. So I do want to take a step back here for some of our listeners who may be less familiar with all this stuff. And I think even for all those of us who are familiar with this stuff, I think going back to some of these basics is really great. So we'll start off with a kind of a fun question here. How fast do avalanches go?
Avalanches can be really small, and they can also be really big. So they can travel at really different speeds. The avalanches that we deal with as recreationalists, they're easily can be traveling in the kind of 30 to 60 mile per hour range. We can get bigger avalanches that travel well over 100 miles per hour. And there's been some estimations of avalanches that have traveled over 200 miles an hour.
Whoa, I hadn't heard that before. There was a human who got caught in an avalanche on Mount Superior in Utah last year. Maybe it was 2 years ago now. And he had Strava or something like that on, and he traveled over 70 miles an hour coming down. You might have heard, you're nodding like you might have heard this. And what kind of avalanches are the most dangerous?
Well, slab avalanches are definitely the most dangerous. That's where we have the most mass, and they're the hardest to predict. So you can get a whole hillside that breaks away from the mountain and goes rolling down into the valley. It's a huge amount of mass releasing all at once, and those are the most destructive.
And what causes the slab avalanche to fracture?
I'm not going to go into the details of it, but essentially, to have a slab avalanche, we need to have conditions in the snowpack, so a structure in the snowpack that allows for a crack to shoot across the hill and detach that slab. And that's why everybody talks about these buried weak layers, because you can think about it sort of as the weakest link in the chain. If that weak link is at the end of the chain, it's going to break, but you're not going to have a huge piece of that chain flopping around someplace. If it's in the middle, that's bad because you end up with two pieces of that chain flopping around. And so if we have a weak snow that's at the top of the snowpack, we're really not concerned about it too much. We're going to be interested in it because it's going to be our problem later on. But if it's buried deep in the snowpack, that's going to allow us to release a much larger mass of snow. And that's where we get into trouble.
Yes. And then humans can trigger those slab avalanches as well, right? That's where we get, what percentage of people that get caught in avalanches triggered the avalanche themselves? It's pretty high, right?
Yeah, it's around 90%. And then that would include people that trigger the avalanche or that somebody in their group triggers the avalanche. Once you start to get into really, really big avalanches, those are actually become kind of hard for people to trigger. And that's because impacting that weak layer, that weak point in the snowpack, deep in the snowpack, can get pretty difficult. When we start having larger human triggered avalanches, people are often releasing them from some thinner part of the snowpack. So if you think about a layer of snow that's formed by the wind moving snow around, those tend to be sort of lens shaped. They're thin, maybe by the top of the ridge line, and then really thick as you go down the slope. And then as you get further down where the wind is just not moving as much snow, they start to get thin again. They're also, maybe there's a rock that's sticking out someplace that produces like a thin area. Those are the common places to trigger really large avalanches. And the largest avalanches that I've seen have been triggered by some sort of weather event, just a, really big snowstorm, big windstorm, some huge loading event.
Yeah. What kind of weather produces avalanches?
Well, snowstorms and windstorms produce most of our avalanches.
Right.
People also talk about rapid temperature changes, especially, in the springtime, but you can get large temperature changes that will produce avalanches, typically some sort of warming event. But snowstorms and windstorms produce the biggest avalanches. And
then I think we're all curious too, how do people die in avalanches?
There's essentially three common ways to die in avalanches. One is by getting some sort of injury in the ride, so trauma. And that's so you're going down the hillside at 50, 60, 70 miles per hour, and you run into a tree or a rock, you go over a cliff. Something happens in that ride where you sustain a life-ending injury. The most common way is to end up getting buried in the debris pile and then dying from asphyxia. So the snow typically has plenty of air in it. The pore spaces are small, so it's hard for the air to circulate. So you're essentially breathing into a paper bag. And eventually there's too much CO2 around your face and you die from CO2 inhalation. And then the third way is from hypothermia. So say you survive the ride and you get buried someplace where you have enough of an air pocket where you're not going to die from asphyxia, and you're unfortunate that you stay there long enough that just being in contact of the snow cools your body and you die from hypothermia. And that's a very, very small percentage of deaths. I think somewhere in the order of 74% of people die from asphyxia, somewhere around 25% die from trauma. And so, right around that 1 or maybe even less than 1% die from hypothermia.
And how much time do you have once you're buried by an avalanche?
It really depends on how you're buried. If you're buried with a big air pocket, there's cases where people have lasted for days buried in an avalanche. That's pretty unusual. Typically, you don't have much of an air pocket. And so I guess on one side, if you have a big air pocket, you could last for a long time. If your airway is packed full of snow, you're sort of down to what they teach you in CPR, which is 4 to 6 minutes.
Wow, scary. So what do you do if you get caught in an avalanche?
The most important thing about avalanches is not to get caught. So you
Agreed.
should spend all of your time not getting caught in an avalanche, because once you get caught, you don't have very many options. But you can think about the three things, the three ways that people get killed in avalanches. That's trauma, asphyxia, and hypothermia. We're not really going to worry about hypothermia too much because that sort of goes into just getting buried. So the first thing that you want to do, that 25% of the people die from trauma. That's being in the flow of the avalanche. So get out of the flow. If you can get off of the slab, off to the side, dig into the bed surface. If you're right near the top, whatever you can do to not be in that flow, do that. If you are stuck in the flow and you can't get out, what's going to kill you at that point is getting buried. So stay on top. Try not to get buried. If you can end up at the bottom of the debris pile with your head sticking out of the snow, you're going to have a lot more time to wait for your friends to come down and dig you out. If your airway is compromised, if your head's under the snow, if you have snow in your mouth, you don't have much time. So anything that you can do to prevent yourself from getting buried or having your airway compromised is what you need to do.
Which also refers to having partners as well, right? Because if you are partially buried and your head's sticking out, but you can't do anything about it because there's nobody there to help you, another bad situation. So,
yes.
So slope angle, we talked a little bit about what's the sweet spot for avalanches? What slope angle causes the most avalanches?
It's in the upper 30s. So, we're right around 38, 39 degrees.
That's the evil number. So yes, I'll keep that in mind because again, that 38, 39 degrees is the perfect black diamond slope that we all love to ski at ski resorts. So you're looking down a slope, you're excited about it, check yourself, think about avalanches.
Yeah, 38 degrees slopes are great to ski down and really fun to snowmobile up.
Yeah, which both puts you in the dangerous situation because you're in that sweet spot. Avalanches just love to occur in that sweet spot. So heads up for that. I really appreciate your time today, Ethan. That's all I've got for you, man. Is there anything else you'd like to add here at the end of the show?
Well, just that it's early in the winter, and I wish that everybody has a great rest of the season. Think about avalanches, but don't let them prevent you from going out into the backcountry. There's great recreation out there. Pick your days, pick your routes carefully, and have a really fun, safe winter.
Terrific advice, as usual, from Dr. Ethan Greene. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day, and let's make sure to stay in touch.
All right. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you so much for listening to the Snowbrains podcast. If you liked this podcast, please share with your friends and family, and please subscribe. To find out more about Snowbrains, please visit us at snowbrains.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Snowbrains. Today's Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Tamarack Resort. For the free spirits that hear the call of the undiscovered and believe the future truly is boundless, Tamarack Resort is the place for you. And we can't wait to welcome you with arms wide open. Find it together at tamarackidaho.com. This episode of the Snowbrains podcast was edited by Jared White. Music by Chad Crouch. And I'm your host, producer, and creator, Miles Clark.